In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Catholic social teaching. This is the lecture for Friday, May 1st. You may notice there's a little different format for today's PowerPoint, and that's because this was the only class that I actually already had a PowerPoint for, and it's based on a public presentation that I give sometimes to summarize what Catholic social teaching is and its various aspects, principles, and implications. So this is a previously prepared PowerPoint, and that's why it looks a little bit different. So the question for today is basically, what are the principles of Catholic social teaching, and how does it guide a Christian to act in the world, and specifically to act within human society? And I place on this first slide an interesting Byzantine icon of the Good Samaritan parable. And the reason that I do that, the reason I see it as a kind of encapsulation of Catholic social teaching, is because it's about helping someone who needs help. And this encounter with someone who needs help happens in public. It happens out in the open on a road from Jericho to Jerusalem. And as you may already know, the story goes that the man on the very left-hand side of the road, it's almost sort of like a iconographic comic strip here, because the event unfolds as you go from left to right. The man who looks in very fine shape at the left is surrounded by devils. And in the parable it says he's surrounded by robbers and beaten to the point of death. And the reason why the robbers are portrayed as devils in this icon is because the robbery itself is a kind of evil. Evil's in the world, and evil renders people beaten. It does real harm. And so the question is, who is going to come and help those who are in need? And who is going to do this in public, in the social sphere? And you see the young man beaten on the ground becomes old, which is meant to indicate that he's been waiting there a long time. Now, the story doesn't say he grew old, he grew a beard, and his hair was white. I don't, he probably couldn't have survived that long. But the person who comes to help him, in this icon anyway, is not only the Good Samaritan is portrayed as Christ himself. And so Catholic social teaching really departs from the conviction that the one who helps us, and the one who helps us through other people, is God himself. God came into the world to heal us of the evil. So Catholic social teaching is really just sort of a social application of this basic principle, that God seeks to heal us, to make us whole, to provide what is required for us to flourish. And so it's Christ himself who takes the man and brings him to the inn and places him on a bed and has him cared for. So it's a kind of theological picture of what help looks like, what solidarity looks like in the social sphere. And so Christians, when they act in the world, when they act in society, are doing so on behalf of Christ. It's really God who is doing this through them. Okay, so generally speaking, what is Catholic social teaching? There's a general sense, and then there's a particular sense of Catholic social teaching. Now, the general sense is really the engagement of the Christian faith with social life. So what does it mean to live the faith here and now? What does it mean to live the faith in the social situations in which I find myself? Pope John the 23rd came up with a nice phrase for what Catholic social teaching is trying to do. It's trying to read the signs of the times in light of the gospel. So we have the particular situations that are before us. Oftentimes they're new, unanticipated. And so what do Christians do in response to these particular situations in which they find themselves, particularly in the social realm? So this is what Catholic social teaching is, generally speaking. And in this sense, it's been around since the beginning of the faith. You can read about it, as we'll see in the New Testament. Christians had to negotiate their social environment, their participation in society, and so social principles began to emerge even in the earliest days of the Christian community. These social principles applied within the community, so how are they to live together as a society of believers, as the kingdom of God, but also how are they to act in a world that maybe didn't share the same fundamental principles that they held. So both internally and externally, Catholic social teaching has been around from the very beginning. Now, in particular, as a body of Catholic teaching, and this is what most people think of when they think of Catholic social teaching, it refers to a body of magisterial texts and teachings that begins predominantly in the late 19th century. I mean, it was around before then, but the Catholic Church dedicates itself more intentionally and directly and explicitly to laying down a body of social teachings that can inform Christians in their actions within society, beginning with Pope Leo XIII in 1891, and it continues to the present moment. And in those teachings, the Church is really trying to lay out principles and recommendations for how Christians should respond to concrete problems and crises that face them in the world, oftentimes very significant ones. Where does Catholic social teaching come from? First and foremost, it comes from Christian revelation, beginning with sacred scripture, sacred tradition, which includes the fathers and the doctors of the Church, the earliest pioneers of the faith, and those whose teachings have been deemed reliable or even essential to the Church's understanding of the gospel. Church teaching through the ages, so the teachings of the magisterium down the centuries, church councils, but also the example of the saints. It's really the saints who exemplify for us what it means to act well as a Christian in society. It also includes the insights of theologians and philosophers. It's informed by the historical experience of the Church, and it also takes into account reason and science, so findings from Christian and non-Christian thinkers alike. So all of these are sources that enter into how the Catholic Church responds to the social issues and problems and developments of each age. So I would like to begin with Scripture and hold up what I think are two scriptural emblems of Catholic social teaching. I already talked about one a little bit. The story of Cain and Abel and the parable of the Good Samaritan, one from the Old Testament and one from the New Testament. The story of Cain and Abel, of course, which occurs very early on in the Bible, Genesis 4, is really about our responsibilities toward one another as human beings. Cain and Abel were brothers, and you know the story. Cain kills Abel. God confronts him, and Cain's response is, am I my brother's keeper? Am I responsible for him? And so very early on in the Bible, God lays down this principle that yes, you are. So you're not only responsible for your own actions, your own well-being, but you're also responsible for the well-being of those around you. Abel's blood cries out from the ground. It cries out for justice. So this is really an exemplification of justice, this story, but it's based upon mutual responsibility. Now, the punchline of the Good Samaritan parable is Jesus' last question to the religious authority that he's conversing with. And it's this religious lawyer, this scholar of the law that asks Jesus, well, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus responds, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then the scholar says, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus responds with this parable, the end of which is, who was the neighbor to the man? And I've already noted how the question itself reverses the perspective of the scholar of the law, who's asking, well, who do I include and who do I exclude in my obligation to reach out and help others? Well, that's answered by the question of putting yourself in the perspective of the beaten man. Who would be a neighbor to me in this situation? Jesus, of course, says, go and do likewise. So it's not only the people who are closest to you, your family, your clan, your nation, but the person who is in need right in front of you, that is your neighbor. Because to be a neighbor to them is, in a sense, a reflection of one's desire for that sort of aid and assistance if one were in that situation oneself. This is a kind of a display of Jesus's great golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is what the Samaritan does, and this is why he is the neighbor to the man. He does what one would hope others would do if one found oneself in that situation. So the Cain story exemplifies justice. But the Good Samaritan story emphasizes charity or love. So justice is sort of about the minimal requirements that we have toward one another, that we at least need to be aware and concerned enough about the well-being of another that we don't kill them. So these are baseline prohibitions of what you really shouldn't do to other people, but also there are baseline obligations that you have toward other people of things you should do. And this speaks to the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, as we'll see, which has to do with your particular role and what the obligations and tasks are for that role. Now, charity or love is really about not just doing what you're supposed to do for others and not doing what you're not supposed to do, but doing what would facilitate a bond of unity, of identification, recognition of the other, full empathy with the other. So solidarity is really this virtue which Catholic social teaching makes a principle that we're all in this together. And so we should do unto other people what we would have them do unto us, because we are bound together as a social whole. All right, what does Catholic social teaching offer to the world? Most generally, it offers a Christian perspective on the social issues of our time. And again, Pope John the 23rd presents a nice summation of what this would involve practically. Catholic social teaching is about being able to see the situation in front of you. And so Catholic social teaching provides principles for reflection that allow us to see the situation rightly that we are placed in. The next step, after we are able to see what's in front of us, is we're able to judge rightly as to its moral content. We're able to evaluate what's going on and say, this is good, this is bad, this is something that I need to endorse and encourage or critique and resist. And so Catholic social teaching offers criteria for judgment. So it offers you principles for reflection to help you see the situation. It offers criteria for judgment to help you evaluate the situation. And finally, it offers directives for action to help guide your response to that situation. So first you see what's going on, then you judge whether it is good or bad, and then you act accordingly. So see, judge, act. This is really the 3 steps of Christian response to social situation. Now, Catholic social teaching is not an ideology, so it's not an all-encompassing social agenda. It's not a political platform. The Church isn't trying to co-opt or capture any political parties with this body of teaching. It's not a program for a non-governmental organization. Pope Francis is always saying that the Church is not an NGO. So it's not trying to intervene or lobby for this or that. The church is not trying to replace the state or control the state. The church is not some interest group or lobby that's competing with other interest groups or lobbies. The church is really just trying to present what the gospel would imply for the particular situations that Christians find themselves in today. So the faithful must apply the proposals of Catholic social teaching according to the particular circumstances of their own community and their own situation. Okay, so a little bit of historical context of Catholic social teaching. Generally, Catholic social teaching responds to pivotal events that emerge in the world, particularly in the modern world. Now remember, this body of explicit teaching really starts to develop in 1891 in the wake of the industrialization of the modern world. But it goes all the way back to the Edict of Milan. So it's only in the year 314 that Christianity itself is decriminalized and made a legitimate practice within the Roman Empire. And even in Romans, we see a reflection of the time before that when Christians were persecuted. So first of all, Christianity becomes legitimate, but then the church itself assumes political responsibility over a large swath of central Italy. And most people don't realize this, but the church was a temporal ruler, a kind of sovereign state, and a powerful one at that, for over 1,000 years, beginning in 752 with the establishment of the Papal States all the way into 1870, in which the Papal States were finally dissolved. Another major event, the Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517. The church is responding to this massive religious and social change that's occurring in Europe and spreading over the world. So how Christians should act within a social situation that now includes Protestants is another pivotal event. The Enlightenment is a huge pivotal event in the history of the church, and particularly the French Revolution in 1789 changes the social landscape. And this occurs alongside of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries to really present the Christian community with a completely different context for practicing their faith and acting in the world. Within the Industrial Revolution, we have the Great Depression, which lasts 10 years, mainly the 30s. And this had a great economic effect, created a lot of economic inequality. And following from 1939, really all the way into 1989, you have war. War takes up, one could argue, the majority of the 20th century, and so it's a huge event on the horizon of Catholic social teaching. And even with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 until 1992, when it was officially abolished, dissolved, the church is actively involved in that situation and proposing new ways of thinking about and envisioning the social world in light of that development. And today I would say the main pivotal event that the church is thinking about in its social teaching is globalization, which includes changes in mass communication like the internet, economic events like the Great Recession of 2008, and climate change. Particularly climate change is growing in prominence in the church's consciousness. So I won't go through all of the major documents, but I just want to sort of show you the number and type. These are extensive church letters. They're called encyclical letters, which means they're meant to circulate among the church. And they're really little books. They're very long documents that diagnose the social issues and the social situation of the time, and then propose ideas and ways of responding, and also criteria for judgment as to how to evaluate the situation before the world. And really the initial document that sets everything in motion is what's called Rerum Novarum, which is really about the conflict between capital and labor, or between the owning class and the working classes. Now, you have successive popes that offer their own contributions to Catholic social teaching. Pope Pius XII is sort of unique because he did it primarily through the radio. He was operating in the context of war. But notice the dates of these. They all seem to correspond directly with some pivotal event. So the Great Depression, 1929, you get an encyclical in 1931. St. John the 23rd, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, I believe. And so then you get this encyclical on peace in 1963. Second Vatican Council is a major document that Catholic social teaching refers to. You have the contributions of Blessed Paul VI. I think he's St. Paul VI now, actually. Where he's responding to decolonialization and increased independence among countries, but also increased inequality. St. John Paul II is a giant contributor to Catholic social teaching, as three main social encyclicals: one on labor, human work, one on solidarity, really, social concerns of the church, also deals with the arms race and the Cold War, and then his encyclical Centesimus Annus, which just means after 100 years, which is really a response to the fall of Soviet communism. Pope Benedict XVI contributed a social encyclical called Charity and Truth, Caritas in Veritate, in 2009, which was largely a response to the Great Recession of 2008. And the latest one that has come out is Pope Francis's Laudato Si in 2015, which is a response to climate change, environmental degradation. It's really all about the environment and ecological stewardship. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the documents that are out there. These are kind of a highlight list. So now let's look at some of the fundamental principles. The first major category of Catholic social teaching principles is the dignity and vocation of the human person. So the Church is primarily interested in the truth about the human person. The truth about the nature and purpose of social life comes from the nature and purpose of the human person. So you first have to get straight, well, what are people? What are people for? And what is the ultimate end of human life? And of course, this links directly to the gospel, what Christians believe about the world and the purpose of human existence. Flowing from this, though, directly is what's called the personalist principle. It's kind of an awkward title, but it just really refers to what most of us, at least most of us Americans, assume. All of social life is an expression of its unmistakable protagonist, the human person, and that the purpose of the state or public authority is to serve the good of its citizens, which basically just adds up to communities are meant to serve the good of their members, and the members of a community or a collective are not ordered to the good of the whole. So totalitarian states, which just sort of see their citizens as fodder or instruments, cogs in the machine, are violating this personalist principle. It's a way of diagnosing whether a community is really serving the human good, whether its authority is legitimate. Is it seeking to serve the good and well-being of the members of its community, or is it seeking to just perpetuate its own power and wealth? Okay. The next category that comes from the dignity and vocation of the human person is that every person has certain rights and every person has certain duties, and these always go together. You have a right to something because you have a duty to someone else. Others have a duty toward you, and that would be your rights, and you have a duty toward others in light of their rights. So everyone is due certain basic goods, and this is a kind of rejection of what's sometimes called in economics the scarcity principle, that there will never be enough for everybody, and so we just have to assume that not everybody's needs can be met. Not everybody's even basic needs can be met. Catholic social teaching rejects this principle in light of the faith that God will provide everything that a person might need. one who's created in God's image. And rights really designate these basic requirements of human flourishing that everyone else has a duty to secure. But with each right comes a duty. Why? Because we all belong to one another. We're all responsible for one another's well-being. We're all our brother's keeper. Now, when these rights are maintained, they ensure freedom from oppression so as to pursue our good. Notice that these rights and duties come from authority that's higher than the state. The state doesn't create rights. The state doesn't impose these duties. They come from our human nature. So just as the legitimacy of public authority comes from whether or not it's serving the good of the human person, so rights and duties come from the very nature of the human person and what's required for human flourishing. So what are these rights? Well, I made a little chart for you. These are the basic requirements of human flourishing according to Catholic social teaching. And the central one is the right to life. And this is primary, and it's at the center because you can't really have any other rights if you don't have the right to life. Your existence has to, in a sense, be secured before you can enjoy any benefits of existence. But within the right to life, there are other rights. You might call these the rights to full life or the rights to abundant life. First of all, there's the right to work. And what goes along with this is the right to a living wage. So the rights to contribute your labor to the community, to contribute the gifts you have to offer, and to receive fitting recompense that will allow you to have the resources you need to survive and to flourish within that society. And connected with this, what really sets what the living wage is the ability to support a family. So everyone should have a right to be a member of a family, to grow up in the environment of a family. That's on the left-hand side there. And everybody should have the right to form a family of one's own and to create that same kind of community that allowed one to become the person they are. There's also rights that have to do with our participation in public, what we need to be full human members of a society. We have the right to culture. So we have the right to, say, speak a language that belongs to our culture. When Stalin invaded the southern part of Finland, he forbade the speaking of Finnish and said you can only speak Russian. It's a violation of the right to culture. Or if you say you can't play your style of music because you can only play the style of music of the dominant group, another violation of culture. Everyone has the right to worship. This can have very concrete implications. So say your employer says you have to work 7 days a week and there's no time to dedicate to worship, to communal worship. That would be a violation of a basic human right. And everybody has the right to an education. So as it was even in this country, if you have to quit school at age 10 in order to go work in the coal mines, you're not receiving the fullness of your right to be educated, to receive the education you need to develop the gifts that you can then contribute through work. So these are all related. They're like links in a chain, but really the basis of all of them is the right to life. So, moving on, the next major category after the dignity of the person is the common good. And this just recognizes the nature of human life together. So a common good is something that A, benefits all who share in it, and B, is not lessened by being shared. It's a kind of mysterious thing, but we encounter it in our daily lives all the time. Something that everybody enjoys together and that doesn't lessen by this sharing. So if you order a pizza, you can share it together with others, but it's not truly a common good because you have to divide it. When you share it, the portion that you have is lessened, right? To the degree that you share it with a certain number of people. But a true common good is actually increased when it's shared. And what would qualify as that? Knowledge, love, justice. And there are things that even approach it, like enjoying the music at a concert. Is there less music for everybody if there's more people that attend a concert? Well, no, in a sense there's more music because there's more people that are responding to it. The music comes alive more. And so this kind of approaches the common good. Now, it can't be universally shared because there's no stadium in the world that can accommodate everybody. So it's not a complete or perfect common good, but it's something that approaches it. So a common good, the more it is shared, the more of it there is. So think, if you know the Pythagorean theorem, somebody asks you to teach it to them, and you say, well, I can't teach it to you because if I give that knowledge to you, I won't have it myself. Right? But actually the opposite is the case, right? The more you teach something, the more you share knowledge, the more of it there is even in yourself, let alone in another person. So the definition of the common good, according to Catholic social teaching, this comes from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So what does that mean? Well, it's as Corkery says, the context or environment that enables people to blossom and achieve their potential. And that's really the sum total of all the social conditions that apply within a society. Corkery says the common good of society could be described as the ethos or fabric of society. It's really the social habitat, the social environment, and it can facilitate flourishing and fulfillment, or it can inhibit or frustrate fulfillment or flourishing. I like Pope Benedict XVI's description, the good of all of us, the good that we share, and the good that we can only have together. What we as a society share completely and simultaneously, because it belongs to everyone and to each person, and we can only achieve it together. So if you live in a just society, everyone shares in that justice and benefits from it together, and you can only really have it together. And likewise with injustice, something that attacks the common good. So you might even compare it, like on a micro level, to a marriage. So when a marriage breaks up, you can divide your goods with your ex-spouse, but you can't divide the marriage itself. You can't say, you take half the marriage and I'll take half the marriage, because you can only really have the marriage if you have it together. The common life is itself a good that can only be enjoyed with another, and so it's a common good. Now this stands in contradistinction with the modern conception of society as just a mere aggregation of disparate spheres that are always in mutual tension with one another. First of all, you have individuals, so you and me, individual persons, the personal or the private sphere, and it's always pulling against the political sphere, which is embodied by the state, and the economic sphere, which is embodied by corporations. And you can have collections of individuals, but they're always, in a sense, going to be subordinate to these other collectives. Corporate collectives or economic collectives and political collectives, the state. And we see this as just sort of a perpetual tug of war. Individuals trying to gain more space for themselves, the state trying to exert and extend its authority, and then the business realm or the corporate realm trying to exert its influence and pulling individuals into it, trying to capture the state through lobbying. And we see it as fundamentally a conflict, as an antagonism. The social realm is fundamentally something where people duke it out and try to get the most for themselves. And you have these three main areas where power is concentrated. But the conception of society in Catholic social teaching is really about a nested sphere, nested spheres of friendship. It's really about progressive spheres of personal communion. Society begins with the personal communion of marriage, and this is where new people come from. It's a little mini society. And from marriage comes intergenerational relationships and the communion of family, extended family. And from there you have a broader community of friends. You might think of your neighborhood or your group of friends. And then beyond that grows, or should grow, the social sphere of work or the economy. So you have families, you have extended families, you have groups of friends, and then you go out and you work and you go out and contribute so that you can live together. This is the organic way things flow out. But you also have private associations, so you might think of groups of corporations or even social clubs. And then beyond that, you have, by necessity, a kind of public authority. The society as a whole, or what we would call today the state. And it organizes everything beneath it. And then finally, you have the sphere of all of humanity. So if marriage is a communion, a bond of communion with another person, humanity is a more extended bond with every other person. So there's a fundamental peace, a fundamental harmony in this way of looking at society that underlies everything. Rather than a sphere of conflict, kind of like a social Darwinist perspective, Catholic social teaching sees peace and harmony at the root of social life. So the next major fundamental principle is solidarity. Solidarity is just the recognition of our communal belonging, our mutual belonging to one another. We're in the same boat. Solidarity is on the one hand a social principle, so we should be interdependent, we should be united to one another. And in this sense, it's just a fact that we are. With globalization, increasing communication, increasing interdependence economically and politically, we are more connected, in fact. But it also has to do with relationships on a personal level. So the new relationships of interdependence between individuals and peoples, which are de facto forms of solidarity, so they're just out there, they're facts, have to be transformed into relationships tending toward genuine ethical social solidarity. So just because I am dependent, my well-being is intertwined with others in the world, that doesn't mean that I have a genuine ethical social bond with them. And this is where the moral virtue of solidarity comes into play. So we should embrace this interdependence, and we should turn it into a form of genuine friendship. St. John Paul II calls solidarity a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, because we are all really responsible for all. So it's embracing this mutual dependence on one another as part of that command to be one another's keeper, to be a neighbor to another. There have been other terms in the tradition for this virtue, the social principle, like social charity, civic friendship, or civilization of love. But solidarity is really the term that's used now. Solidarity is a form of love. It's the love that's manifested in social life. Now, it may not be as personal and deep and extensive or permanent as marriage or friendship, but nevertheless, societies can be characterized by a kind of mutual willing the good of another. Solidarity also maximizes another social principle, participation. It's through solidarity that nobody gets left behind. The more people are drawn into a society's activity, the more that they can express and contribute themselves to the common good. Participation is really just the maximization of people's active contribution within society. Example of solidarity, Amish barn raising. You may know about this custom. So in the Amish community, if a new barn needs to be built, a call goes out, and pretty much everyone in the community shows up on a single day and builds the barn in a single day. So you see scenes like this where scores of people are on site working together for a common purpose. It's solidarity because everybody comes together. Everybody is seeking to help their fellow community member. And they realize that this is something that they hope others would do for them, and so they go and help do it for others. So it involves common activity, it recognizes common interdependence, and it creates social bonds. Another example, providing meals for people after a baby is born, postpartum meal preparation. This is one that my own family has experienced. So a community of friends bands together to organize meals and dinners for families that have just welcomed a new child, recognizing a particular need that they have, and coming together as a community of friends to help their fellow friend in need, with the idea that I might be in this situation myself one day. And so it recognizes interdependence, but also the possibility of need and a present need, and it also creates kind of social bonds. All right, the next social principle, the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity, it's kind of a mouthful, but it just refers to the principle that recognizes and orders the different roles of the different individuals, but also the different groups in society. It's a matter of justice because it's a matter of allowing each of these particular individuals and groups to do what they can to contribute to the whole. So you might think of like different roles in a play. Everybody has their role, and subsidiarity would be to allow each person to speak their lines, to contribute their particular task to the overall project that you're trying to accomplish together. It recognizes that we are not all the same. We have different roles, and these differences matter. So the vulnerable should receive special protection. And this is where the word subsidiarity comes from. Subsidium kind of, comes from like the root of subsidize. Subsidium just means help. So subsidiarity is about helping those in society, particularly those in need, and helping the poor first. And here we come across one of the principles that Corkery mentions, the preferential option for the poor. I like to think of this as a kind of triage principle in Catholic social teaching. It's really about helping those in most need first, just like a doctor would help the patient who's in the most need in the emergency room first, even if they're not the one who is next in line. So it's about the distribution of help or aid. But subsidiarity particularly tries to help every sphere or group in society do what it can do to contribute to the common good. So higher order groups should always help lower order groups when they need it. That's one half of the principle. But higher order groups must never simply absorb or contravene lower order groups. So to go back to the play analogy, if you have the director saying, well, you're not doing your role right, so I'm just going to play your role. And then they say, well, that other person, they're not doing well enough either, so I'm going to play their role as well. You're having this progressive absorption of the roles of lower order groups by higher order groups. And this is very characteristic of totalitarianism, for instance. So higher order groups should not simply absorb or contravene lower order groups, rather they must help them so that these lower order groups can perform their proper and rightful function. Subsidiarity also maximizes participation because it maximizes everybody's involvement. It's saying you have a particular task to perform and we're going to help you do that task. And so it's recognizing that a particular person can more effectively do their work rather than have their work done for them. So what are some examples of subsidiarity? Well, you have good subsidiarity, and then you have examples of violations of subsidiarity. So a good example would be the U.S. auto bailout in 2009. So the auto companies in the U.S. found themselves in great need. They were about to go belly up and maybe even close. So the government stepped in and said, you need help. You're performing a function within society. You are contributing something to our society. You find yourself in need of help to carry out that task, so we're going to help you. But notice that the help here has to be temporary. We're going to get you back on your feet again. And so there's a kind of balance here where we're going to get you back on your feet again, but we're not going to take over your job, do your job for you. And that's exactly what happened with the auto bailout. So they were given an infusion of capital. They were able to get back on their feet, make the necessary reforms, and then pay back that money ahead of schedule. An example of a violation of subsidiarity would be China's one-child policy. So I say it's bad subsidiarity, but it's really not subsidiarity at all. It's kind of like anti-subsidiarity. Why? Because it's saying the state is going to determine for families how many children they can have. And it's really rightfully up to the family. I mean, remember the human right of family formation. Every individual has the right to form a family, and part of that is to determine the proper size of that family. So if a higher order group is taking over that job of the family, they're not allowing the family to do a job that is proper to it. And so that would be an example of the violation of subsidiarity. Well, let's go back to these solidarity examples that I mentioned. I just want to point out that these two principles, solidarity and subsidiarity, grow together. There's a kind of synergy between these two principles. So for instance, insurance companies can help replace barns. So an Amish person finds that their barn has fallen down or burned down. Insurance company can come in and do that. And likewise, government programs can help new mothers to get the food that they need. They can give them food stamps or the equivalent today. But what happens when that is the response? What is lost in those responses to a particular need? Well, what's lost is the personal connection. What's lost is the sense of community and the sense that, well, one is doing this job for oneself. So solidarity, coming together, leads to subsidiarity. I'll help them because they are my friends. I'll help them because they are part of my community and they have a role to play within my community. But subsidiarity also leads to solidarity. Those people, my community, helped me when I was in need, so our friendship has grown, and so I will help them. And at the lowest possible level, people help each other to perform the tasks that they need to perform within society without having larger order groups come in and take over those tasks. This preserves the social bond, the social fabric at the level of human relationships. And it just recognizes that really friendship itself is the greatest gift that we can offer to one another within the social realm. Not just resources, but friendship itself. And friendship is what the market and the state alone can't provide. All right, so the next major principle is private property, which is really kind of a form of subsidiarity. The ownership of material goods is necessary for human fulfillment, but it's not an absolute right. It's not infinite. So when there are claims to private property and they violate justice or they detract from the common good, they can and should be overridden. So everyone should have the goods that they need to perform the tasks that are rightfully theirs, particularly with regard to the family. Private property is really a function of the human right to family, mostly. So a family needs to have property of its own in order to grow as a family and function as a family. But if you have so many goods that you're not allowing other people to exercise their rights, then the principle of private property becomes subordinate to a greater principle. And that principle is the universal destination of created goods. And this is really a reflection of solidarity, because it's saying that the goods of creation really belong to all of us. We're all in the same boat. And so if all material goods belong to God ultimately, how does God intend them to be used? Well, first and foremost, he intends them for everyone. So the goods of the world are not just the prerogative of a certain subset of humanity, they're meant for everyone. And so whatever we use within creation, whatever we use and own provisionally. It's something that we're kind of borrowing, and so we're stewards of it. And if we're hoarding it and pretending like it's ours indefinitely, then we're misusing those created goods. We're not recognizing what they really are. The universal destination of created goods recognizes that created goods are not always ours forever and always. They're only for the sake of contributing our part to the common good. Okay, so we've got subsidiarity, solidarity, private property, universal destination of created goods. You also have the dignity of work, which is, again, a kind of outflow of subsidiarity. Work is both an obligation and a right. You have a job to do, and you are obliged to offer your gifts to the community, but you also have a right to do so. So if you have a particular gift and society is preventing you from contributing that gift, then that's a sign of something gone wrong. Work is a reflection of human cooperation with God's creative activity. We act upon the world through our work as a response to God's command to subdue the earth, to till the soil, to till the land, to develop the world in a particular way that imprints upon it the image of God that's within us. So this is really the dignity of work, why it's a vocation that bestows dignity upon the individual. So the other side of this coin is the stewardship of creation. So again, this is recognizing that we're all in the same boat, that what we're working upon, namely the created world, is something that we have to share with others. The natural world is not simply raw material for us to manipulate and consume. We are responsible for caring for the world. So you have these two wings, you might say, of subsidiarity and solidarity. And they work themselves out through these principles of private property and the universal destination of all goods on the one hand, and then the dignity of work and the stewardship of creation on the other hand. So one is about how we own or use, possess goods. One is about how we act within creation. We work upon creation, so it's not sacrosanct, but it's also not something that we can do whatever we want with. All right, finally, Corkery mentions at the end of his article these 4 fundamental values of social life. The first being truth, which is really about who we are and what we're called to. This informs all of these principles that we've talked about. It's a fundamental value. Catholic social teaching is basing all that it teaches upon claims about what's true about human life, about God, about creation. It also is recognizing the fundamental value of freedom. Freedom from oppression and injustice, but freedom also to pursue the good in the world. And so, for instance, the right to religious practice, religious worship, people have to have a certain sphere of freedom to believe what they believe, not because somebody says they should believe it, but because it's a free choice of their own. However, they should have the ability to pursue what they believe within the public realm. Okay, so the next one, love. This should infuse all of society, and mostly through the principle of solidarity. People should bond together, form bonds of friendship with one another, but we should also recognize that there are proper obligations that we have to other people, and that we have to give them what is their due. And this is the fundamental value of justice. So when you have a society that really embodies truth, freedom, love, and justice, what you have is what the Catholic social teaching tradition calls integral human development. So what is integral human development? Well, it's based on the idea that human society is in fact developing technologically, economically, culturally. Things are moving forward. There is progress in human society. But the question is this development or is this progress always good? Well, sometimes yes. So progress can apply to, say, sanitation, but it can also apply to weapons of mass destruction. Progress can also be negative. Technology can give us tools to increase the human good. It could also give us tools to damage the human good. Well, one way of getting at whether a particular mode of progress is good or bad is asking, well, who benefits from it? Who benefits from the development that's occurring in the world? So if you have vast social inequalities, say between classes, the poor and rich, between races, between nations, this is a sign that development is not integral, meaning it doesn't include everybody. And so true progress is the development of the human person and of all human people. So it's the development of the whole person. So it's not that just we're getting more money or even that we're getting more political freedom, but that we're becoming better people, that we're developing in body, in mind, and in spirit. And it's the development of all people. So nobody gets left behind. All people should benefit from the development of human society. And this has a particular relevance to human ecology. So human ecology encompasses not only the natural world, but also the social and cultural and moral environment, the political and economic environment in which human beings find themselves. So one could ask, is my human environment inhabitable? It might be inhabitable in terms of the natural world, but am I able to flourish given the social and cultural, political and economic conditions in which I find myself? Does our social life lead to our fulfillment as human persons? Now, this is really the central question. This is what determines whether society is organized toward the common good. And there are concrete indicators of this. So if you have a high rate of suicide or a high rate of drug use in your society, if people are more depressed or more despairing than in other societies, this is an indicator that there's something wrong with the human ecology, and that this is not really a result of integral human development. People are not flourishing as a result of the changes that are happening within a society. Okay, finally, what are the practical directives for Catholic social teaching? What does Catholic social teaching tell us to do? Well, there are some concrete ones. It really begins with a support for labor unions and civil associations with Leo XIII. It involves a resistance to all forms of totalitarianism or statism, where the state assumes ultimate authority over every sphere of life. It says that Christians should help underdeveloped countries on their own terms, so help them develop as themselves without disrupting their culture or their community. Christians should also promote and expand world authorities. Now, this is disputable, contestable, I would say, but nevertheless, it's there. So the Catholic social teaching tradition is a great supporter of the United Nations and other world authorities. It says we should stop producing and stockpiling nuclear weapons. It takes a very strong stand on this, on the arms race, on certain types of weapons, nuclear, biological, chemical weapons. It's saying these are bad. We should strengthen social policies that foster family life. So pro-family policies are good and what we should pursue. We should always oppose threats to life, such as abortion, euthanasia, war, and all direct attacks on human life, including capital punishment. It takes a pretty strong stand against capital punishment in the modern world. And we should halt and reverse environmental degradation. This is the latest, most emphasized directive for action. So this brings us to the end of that list of seeing the world in a certain way, of evaluating what's going on in the world, judging what's happening, and then acting in response. See, judge, and act. Okay, so that's Catholic social teaching in a nutshell. I will have the discussion boards up momentarily, and hopefully I'll see some of you at the live discussion group meeting on Friday. So until then, take care, and see you again on Monday.